Welcome back to the channel. Now today we're going to explore Chapter 14 of the American Yawp. This is going to focus on the Civil War, with an emphasis on the vocabulary terms from the chapter to help you understand the major events, people, strategies that's going to define this pivotal period in American history. So let's dive into it. Now the Civil War begins officially with the attack on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. This Confederate assault on a Union garrison in South Carolina was the spark that ignited the war. Secession had already happened with 7 of the states, 4 states yet to have left the Union to join the Confederacy. And actually the attack on Fort Sumter in many ways is going to lead to that exodus as well. The Confederate leaders were driven by a sense of Confederate nationalism. They believed that fighting this war or standing up for themselves was a way to preserve their distinct way of life and states' rights and all those things that they had more or less stood for. Now, why did they attack Fort Sumter? Well, Fort Sumter was a federal garrison in the middle of the harbor, the mouth of the harbor to Charleston Bay, Charleston Harbor. Now, Charleston is a major city in the South. It's a major trade port in the South. And it's almost like saying, all right, I own the house, but no one's going to let me use my driveway. And that's kind of the way that the South viewed the occupation by Union forces of Fort Sumter. You can't let someone continue to camp out in your driveway. Now, meanwhile, the Union had to secure the border states. Kentucky and Maryland are both talking about secession. These are southern states in mindset. They're slaveholding states as well, and they will eventually stay loyal to the Union, but really it's going to be a matter of key battles and key political strategy on the part of the Lincoln administration that's going to keep them in the Union. Now, what about Virginia and some of the others? Well, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas and Tennessee are going to be states that will, in fact, eventually leave the Union and join the Confederacy, but they are not part of that original 7. They don't leave prior to Fort Sumter. What happens after Fort Sumter is President Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteer troops to put this war down, to put the Confederacy down. Well, representatives of those 4 states basically say, we may not have been in favor of secession. We were not going to secede, but we're not going to fight to stop others from doing it as well. You're going to force us to fight. We're not going to do it, so we're gone. And that's the way this sort of works out. Now, let's just kind of jump back to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee had originally been offered command of the Union Army, but he's from Virginia. He knows the way his state's going to go, and he basically says, I will not fight against my people, fight against my state. So maybe we'll get back to that a bit more as we move through this conversation. Now, the Union war strategy will be called the Anaconda Plan. It's going to be aimed to strangle the Confederacy by blockading its ports, by capturing and controlling the Mississippi River, and also eventually to capture the chief city of Richmond. But the Mississippi River and the blockade are the 2 big parts of this. Cut off the Confederate supplies, divide their territory. Now, the Union forces are going to advance, and as they advance, enslaved peoples are going to escape to the Union camps, and we refer to these individuals as contraband. Union leaders are going to eventually recognize these individuals as assets to the war effort, pave the way for policies like the Emancipation Proclamation, which we passed in early 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. Now, this is a monumental order. It'll declare freedom for enslaved peoples in Confederate-held territories, reframing the war as a fight against slavery. So before this, it's about preserving the Union. This is sort of changing the goal of the war halfway through it. So we do have that going on. Now, it's not as simple as you might think it would be, because it doesn't free anybody immediately. President Lincoln cannot free slaves in Confederate territory because he didn't control the Confederate territory. But as the Union continues to roll through that and win key battles, then it's going to expand the amount of individuals affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. It also opens the door to recruiting African American soldiers to fight in the Union Army. Now, let's talk about some key battles and leaders. 2 major military leaders emerged in the early part of the war. George Britton McClellan. He's a cautious Union general. He had graduated West Point. I think he was a railroad in the railroad business at the beginning of the war. He is going to take charge of the Army of the Potomac, basically the Union Army around Washington, D.C., and in Virginia and in the East. Robert E. Lee, a brilliant Confederate strategist whose father had been a hero of the American Revolution, he's going to fight for the Confederacy here, what we call the Army of Northern Virginia. And he's going to continually outmaneuver McClellan. over and over and over again, McClellan just will not see the successes that Lincoln would hope that he would see. Now, some of the war's most significant battles between these two men are going to happen in and around the Battle of Antietam, or as the Confederates called it, the Battle of Sharpsburg. It's the single bloodiest day in American history, with something like 22,000 dead in a single day. This is going to be the turning point that makes possible the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in the Battle of Gettysburg, which happens in July of 1863, this will be the turning point that marks the beginning of the Confederate decline. We call this the high tide. These Union victories are crucial. It's going to bolster morale and weaken Confederate forces as well. Antietam is sometimes viewed as a draw, but it's enough of a victory that it turns England, which could have been an asset to the Confederacy, it drives them away, because now we're going to start talking about slavery more than Union. Another major victory happens in Vicksburg. Lee and McClellan are not involved here. General Grant is, though, and Grant is going to be moving up in the ranks, up in notoriety, as after the Battle of Vicksburg. And this is where the Federal forces, the Union forces, gain control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two. Now, what about life during the war? Life on the front lines certainly was not easy. Deployments were long, sometimes months, if not years. Camp life was marked by disease, boredom, and harsh conditions. And meanwhile, advancement in medical technology is going to be slow. It's going to struggle to keep up with the scale of the injuries, leading to high mortality rates. New types of ammunition like the mini ball is going to be so much more deadly than the old smoothbore muskets in the past. Rifled muskets, which had been around for years but now are being mass-produced in a way that really the old Napoleonic stand in line and shoot each other tactics are just simply not going to... The scale of death is going to greatly increase as technology increases. We also see some of the first repeating firearms in the form of some rifles and also the Gatling gun. So again, a lot of things are happening. We're also going to see, though, we're going to learn a few things, and I'm just going to throw this in there. The book doesn't talk about it. But one thing we discover is that by boiling water kills diseases, it helps to disinfect. The Confederacy was running low on its supplies, particularly thread to stitch up wounds, such as from amputations and all of that. And so they began to take horsehair. And that horsehair, they realized, was too stiff to use to sew up wounds. So they would boil the horsehair. It would make it soft and pliable. They could use it as thread. Well, they began to realize that wounds stitched up by this boiled horsehair had a whole lot less infections than someone that was stitched up by thread that was taken out of a box and handled with dirty hands. So again, we begin to learn things. Necessity is the mother of invention. Well, we're going to start to learn a few things about germ theory and how diseases are spread, and we're going to start to see certain advancements in medical technology down the road here, further increased with the Franco-Prussian War, which goes on in Europe just a few years after this. Now, life on what about back home? War widows, those women whose husbands have been killed, and also and other members of the family are going to bear the brunt of the conflict's social and economic toll. Many women step into new roles, managing farms, businesses, and even aiding the war effort as nurses and in some cases as spies. Now, as the war drags on, Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman are going to adopt a strategy of hard war or total war, targeting not just Confederate armies but also their resources and sometimes the civilian populations. Sherman's march to the sea, for example, will go from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Savannah, burning a 60-mile swath. If it's not something they can take with them, they burn it or kill it. Not people, of course, but livestock and so on. Leaves just a swath of devastation, 60 miles wide from Atlanta to the sea. And this is going to destroy railroads, crops, and most importantly, Confederate morale. Women are sending letters to their husbands saying, listen, this is what's happening. And their husbands start to desert the army to try to get back and take care of the situation back at home as best they can. Now, on the home front, in the North, tensions are going to rise. Right around about the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, we're going to start to see a new conscription law go into place, a new draft law to bring people into the army, because this is going to be the strategy in the last part of the war. To replace soldiers in the North that the Confederacy cannot replace. Kill as many Confederates as you can because they can't replace them. But the Union is seeing an influx of immigration. But Many of these immigrants don't want to serve in the war. This is not their fight. And so we see the New York draft riots in 1863. They happen in other places too, but in New York, that's the big one. And just resistance is going to explode into violence. And it's going to basically fueled by racial tensions, class tensions, and job competition in many, many ways. Now, Black Americans are going to play a significant role in this as well. Over 180,000 African Americans are going to serve in the Union Army as part of the United States Colored Troops, and there's some very notable units that are going to serve, like at Fort Fisher. We're going to see fighting there, particularly throughout the last part of the war. 180,000 is a lot of individuals. Some of them had run away from slavery in the South. Some were freedmen in the North already. A big combination of different groups come together to form up the United States Colored Troops. Now, getting into the final chapter here. The war is going to culminate in the election of 1864. Abraham Lincoln is going to win in that year. Now, he's running against George McClellan, who had been pretty much fired in the aftermath of Antietam. He might have sort of won a victory, fought to a draw, but he didn't destroy Lee there. And so he was fired by Lincoln. Well, he comes back in 64 as a peace Democrat candidate. He wants to run to end the war, to negotiate peace, let the South go. That's the stance of McClellan. And Lincoln really thinks he might lose this war, at least not lose this election. Interestingly enough, the voting age was 21, and the average age of the Army was around 20, and they love McClellan. If the voting age had been 18 like today, McClellan probably wins the election in 1864. But that's not the reality. That's not what it was. The voting age was 21. So McClellan loses, Lincoln wins, and he goes into the end of his first term and into the beginning of his second with the end of the war in mind. His election is going to bolster the Union, bolstered by military Union successes. Sherman is going to defeat, basically take the city of Savannah. He says, in fact, the letter that Sherman sends tells Lincoln, he says, "I offer you, sir, Savannah as a Christmas gift." So that happens then. The capture of Atlanta a few months before that. These are victories that are going to be enough to restore confidence in the Lincoln administration. Now, the Civil War is going to be a transformative period in American history. It's going to reshape the national political, social, and economic systems. We're going to see a number of pivotal battles and bold strategies. It's going to have an enduring legacy. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, goes into effect, which eventually will free the slaves with the 13th Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't do anything about slaves in those few northern states that still have them, or the border states like Kentucky or Maryland or Missouri, and some of the ones that remain loyal. It doesn't free the slaves there at all. The 13th Amendment will do that. But this war is going to change a lot of things. We're going to start to see northern industry really begin to expand as well in the aftermath of the war. So a lot of things are changing. And then, of course, we've got to put it all back together with the Reconstruction, which will be the last video in this series dealing with History 1301. So thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Leave me a comment if you want to. Give me a thumbs up if you want to as well. And I will see you next time. Take care. Good luck on those final exams if you're taking them.